Welcome to the Soulful Entrepreneur podcast. I'm your host, Lucy Stepanyan. In this week's episode, we have the founder of Skins Agency, evidence-based branding agency focusing on data and psychology, Leart Zogjani. The focus of our conversation will be how personal branding can help aspiring entrepreneurs in building their startups. Welcome, Leart.
Great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it was really hard to pronounce your last name, by the way, which is a
It's always
struggle that,
important.
yeah, a struggle that I have with my last name as well. But I think it's the way to go. It's fine.
Yeah, well, we're living in a big world, I guess. So different cultures. Good that
True.
we intend to learn. So that's cool.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've always been fascinated by just the idea of building a brand based on psychology. And I know that that's something that you've been researching. Everything that you do is based on a lot of research, and you've been in the space for more than 10 years, I guess. Can you walk us through a little bit the connection between psychology and branding itself?
Yeah. I mean, one of the coolest, I try to meet as many people in the industry as possible and always ask, what does branding mean to you? And one of the coolest sort of um formats that I've come across was branding is the stories we tell people to tell themselves about themselves. And
Hmm.
so it's, whenever I buy any sort of product, I don't just relate to the product, I buy that brand, and by association to that brand, I start building a story of who I am, right? So that
Hmm.
brand has given me a story to tell myself about myself. And so by that sort of definition, if we're telling people sort of like if we're supporting them in building a story about who they are, we are connecting to their deepest sense of self, to their deepest sense of, well, maybe not the deepest, rather the sort of sometimes more superficial and sometimes it goes deeper, sense of identity. And identity is directly connected to psychology, and any layer of self-knowledge goes through some layer of understanding your identity. And so because branding sort of touches so close to a person's identity, psychology is intrinsically linked to it. And so my goal for the last couple of years has been to try to understand this. It's like, what kind of person, what personality does this group of people generally tend to have, that generally tend to like this sort of product? How do they generally communicate? And I'm using generally constantly, and I know we're in a world where generally does not sound like the best thing, but in science we tend to generalize most of the time, right? Because if we go specific, then it only applies to a single person, and as a brand we're trying to appeal to as many people as possible, so finding commonalities is crucial to our work. And so we try to find these commonalities in personality traits, because at least as a company we believe that by personality is one of those more stable aspects of ourselves, and branding is an intention to build a long-term relationship. Thus we tap on more stable psychological aspects, as opposed to what marketing does, which tries to get things done fast and quickly. So it's more about neuromarketing, it's more about reaction. In branding we're trying to build this long-lasting relationship, so we're looking at sort of the more stable aspects of your psychological traits and seeing how can we build a story that sort of that infrastructure of your personality would easily connect to or best connect to. And so this is sort of that relationship. We're constantly building these stories, but these stories have to really resonate and really reflect a sort of story within your personality. And because of that, the relationship between psychology and branding is like linked, I believe, almost one to one in that respect. Like you can't have
Mhm.
one without, or at least without having a look at the other, right? And it's cool to see how whenever we go on a call with clients and like we've pulled some data about some of the personality traits of their audience, and we say it seems like your audience like has these kind of traits, and generally they're like, that's exactly what they seem like, but I've never put this in words. And it's really cool to see how actually brands that connect closest to their audience are the ones that know them best personally, so to speak. So I'd say there's a very, very close connection between the two. A very long answer, by the way. Sorry, I keep doing this.
No worries. No worries. I actually want to fish out some of the things that you mentioned. One of them,
Yeah.
you said it's a story. And I want to understand because that in my head, it's always, okay, who is this story about? Is it about a story about the founder? Is it a story about a product? Is it a story that you create that resonates with the audience? I have a little bit of a confusion as you say that.
Well, I would opt to say that it's always about the user, right?
Mhm.
So it's the story that the user takes from us to tell themselves about them, something, a story about themselves, right? But I also don't see that many stories out there that are authentic and that people believe, that aren't really deeply rooted to the story of the founder or to the story of the team behind the product. And so the idea is we're trying to appeal to some people with that story, but
Mhm.
that story has to be real enough to us for us to believe in the first place before we can actually make others believe. And so it's this constant conversation between the two parties. It is, I believe, the core of the story is about the founder. If we're talking about the individual, and if we're talking about the, probably the solopreneur or like a small business, then generally speaking, it seems to me like the founder really needs to bring out their personal story out there, verbalize
Mhm.
it well enough, understand who they as individuals connect best to, and then amplify that story so people that hear it want to be connected to the story. And so ultimately, it is about the user, but it has to stem into to sort of come out of the founder themselves, I believe. It's just founders are people with a vision, people that have something internal that's driving them, and people like to follow people who really drive new ideas forward. And so because of that, they need to work a lot in pushing that story from inside to outside so that
Mhm.
people can hear and then relate to it.
Yeah.
So
So basically, the story is born within the founder and then it finds resonance with the audience. I have like a quick question on that as well. As I'm thinking about that, it really resonates with me. And I believe that the founder is basically the one who gives birth to the brand and to the company, right? But at the same time, you want to make sure that the brand that is built kind of then separates from the founder and grows on its own. So I'm thinking like, is there going to be an issue if you think about creating a brand, build a brand that is based solely on the founder and is born out of the founder? Are, are you going to have issues later on separating the brand and kind of having this cutting the cords?
mm, that's a very good question, and it's one of those that we keep on coming back to. So there's all these businesses that are completely sort of relying on the founder's ability to find leads, to find customers, and it's because that founder is great at doing sales or at telling the story, and then they really struggle to, when the founder is tired of it and wants to retire out of that position and work on the business instead of in the business. It starts to becoming and it starts to become an issue.
Yeah.
It's an interesting thing because it seems like there's this weird curve where businesses start where the founder has most of the brand on their own,
Mhm.
and then we had all of this time where just it would be about companies, but now we're seeing all this wave of personal branding still affecting back to our ability to sell better. And I would argue that, look, ultimately, if you're scaling a company, you're going to have your company's brand stronger than your individual brand, right? But then if you also look at companies as large as Apple, we would connect with Steve Jobs over Apple so much, right? We
Yeah.
love that guy, his vision, his ideas, and then once Steve Jobs wasn't there, we were still connected to Apple. But let's be honest, like for me as a designer, Steve Jobs is still out there because he really could connect. He brought a story up there that nobody else could bring. And so there's truth to the aspect that a founder's brand can still help the company succeed and become big. But then
Mhm.
again, just as much as as the brand that Steve Jobs had, he also built a great brand with Apple as a separate company. So with him parting, it didn't mean that Apple then failed afterwards. So we need to work on the company brand for sure, but I believe that the founder's personal brand can really build up a user's trust in the company, because we
Yeah.
trust people more so than we trust just companies and like things that aren't sort of tangible in a way, if I may. So
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with that. And I like that the what you just said, which is we trust people more than we trust intangibles, which is brands, let's say, and the brand will be strengthened only with the help of the people. At some point, it will become more independent as Apple. I actually want to talk about a little bit about the personal branding and influencers. We live in an era when you see anyone and everyone who has more than 50K or even 10K followers, they start either selling products that are not their own, but also they start their own brands and they start their own companies and they start selling products, launching businesses. Do you think that this way of doing business is an innovation and that has kind of changed the way that people launch and start businesses? In an essence, has the old traditional way of doing business been shifted in the recent years due to
So
influencer era?
I don't know. Should I say that maybe we went full circle? If you look back at the Asian sort of empires of the time, right? Ottoman Empire, and you look at how bazaars work, it was all like individual, families or individuals who had this particular trade that were great at it, and everybody in the village or in the city around them knew them for that, and they'd go because it's that guy that can build these really cool vases, right?
Yeah.
And it seems to me like we're building something similar now. Like we first went to building all these huge companies, but now we're seeing influencers, and I'd rather say creators, more so starting to build their own brand, like people in their tribes around them starting to recognize them for their taste, for their great ability to pull things together, and then they buy off of them because they trust them as the individual. So it's almost like coming to a full circle to back into very decentralized markets where just individuals have these very small brands, which is kind of one of those things I really like, because it brings
Mm-hmm.
this, well, speaking of this, a very soulful aspect of the market itself, right? Because it's more about each individual pouring their hearts out and building something that they believe looks pretty and looks beautiful and works best for that
Mm-hmm.
particular use case. And then a smaller group of people, but still connects to them in a very deep sense. And so I like that a lot, to be honest. I can see a lot of connections to also what's happening in the industry. I had a conversation a while ago with a company called Flagship, and what they were doing is basically just this: empowering creators to build their own shops, so they don't sort of get caught up in just getting some sort of a chunk of the revenue from the products they're selling for others, but rather whatever products they like, they put in their own shop and then they sell it forward. So they were empowering creators to become entrepreneurs by just utilizing the strength of their network. And so personally, I really love that. I'm not entirely sure how scalable that is and where that goes. But you can see that more and more that individuals who've just been great at a particular thing, they manage to scale that up. They manage to use that all the trust that they build over time with their network, and it's still the person. If I may take a specific example, I've just recently purchased a service to help me build my sales processes in the company. But it was all of that was built off of a single person who was a great salesman, and this great salesman turned everything he knew into short courses. Then he hired account managers who knew everything about the course to walk us through his courses and to handhold us to basically build all the system. So he managed to scale himself into processes and a huge company that's generating a couple of million a year, which is really, really cool. And it's still based off of the founder's brand, personal brand, but it is scaled up to be this great company. So I definitely see some really cool stuff happening around the ability of a single individual to scale themselves into a business. But
Mm-hmm.
that's still some. I mean, you'd still see something very different when you're looking at startup scaling, getting VC funds, and
Yeah.
that's still not happening on an individual level. But speaking about business as a whole, there's quite a bit of potential there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating to me to see how the world has been shifting in terms of entrepreneurship and business. And I see more and more people, creators, starting their own businesses and launching. And it's inspiring on the one hand, but on the other hand, I'm thinking, okay, if I'm an entrepreneur, if I'm aspiring to be an entrepreneur, should I start thinking about actually building a personal brand before I even start thinking about launching a product? Would you say that that's a winning strategy in this century?
Um, well, of the century, maybe that's a huge word. We're living in a century
Yeah,
where, everything is changing in 6 months' time. So I wouldn't
true.
dare. I would say, insofar as I can tell from even running my own business, the people that are good at building communities, that are good at building trust among other people, are most probably going to have a much higher chance of succeeding in business. And so, building a
Mhm.
personal brand, whether or not you're going to use that directly in your business, it is going to help you understand how to connect and how to communicate with people. And I'm 100% sure that it's going to be one of those huge values that you can definitely utilize to build and scale a brand and a company
Mhm.
of whatever sort. So yeah, I'd say 100%. Like, it's one of those things that it's definitely very useful. Um, then whether or not that's the one way to do it, I don't think so. Like, there's always more than one way, and there's always more than one type of business. And so, there are these businesses that don't need a brand at all. Chat GPT barely had any brand. It just had
True.
like a solution that blew everybody's mind. And so, there's that. But for most of us in business, we need to build our relationships first, and then be able to sell the product that we've built. So I'd say, yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Was that the case for you? Have you started? I know that at first you were more of a designing agency, a designer agency, and then it morphed into branding agency, and then basically had more and more experience with customers, and it became skins agency at some point. How was it for you, this journey? Did you start out by just building relationships and doing work here and there, and then you're building a community, and then it morphed into something else, or did you start an agency from the start?
Yeah, well, I mean, I started working in the design field since I was 14, and I did a lot of freelance work, and then eventually started the company. So 100%, it only started because my ability to sort of complete all the tasks, and the amount of work that was coming in to the door was smaller than that amount. So I had to hire more people, and all of a sudden I had a company. And so it 100% sort of helped to have a personal brand, so to speak, to have enough incoming requests before we started doing that. And even from there,
Mhm.
then, I went into a bit of like searching of what bigger value I can provide and how I can connect the value that I'm building to the businesses that I'm serving. And so I also shifted that into more sort of evidence based.
Mhm.
But all of that has been built through the network of people 100%. And so I'd say, yeah. And now, and I mean, probably you've seen that a lot on my LinkedIn. I've tried to build my personal brand, which interestingly enough has worked relatively well in connecting with some people that I really wanted to connect with. And I
Mhm.
get sort of connections, and I get conversations that otherwise I wouldn't have gotten to. And then that's spilling over to the company, which now I'm building the sort of processes inside to push on sales. And so I'm always connecting my personal brand here with my company brand there. And so one for building trust, and the other for closing, and for more of a bottom of the funnel type of work. So
Mhm.
I'm definitely symbiotic when it comes to these two brands, if I may.
Yeah. So walk me through that process of at what point did you realize that we can create something that's scalable and just this evolution of changing skins into something more of a business, not just a service provider, but more a startup, basically.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're still most of our revenue comes in from the service side. So the way that this has happened is basically 2019 was one of those years that I was going through some soul searching when it comes to the company. It felt like, we're a design agency, that's great, but I couldn't still connect design to the amount of money that I was getting from my customers. Like, if I'm doing
Mhm.
this pretty and beautiful design, like, okay, but how much money are they getting out of me if they're giving me an X amount of money? And I,
Mhm.
I really got sort of into thinking about what is the actual value of what I'm doing. And so moving towards that deeper and deeper, I needed to build some sort of a system where design would be at least to a certain degree more measurable. Because again, we're not a marketing company. It's not really easy to see the effects of a brand as easy as it is to see of a marketing campaign, right?
Mhm.
And so it got me into building what we have, what we've had for a couple of years, these very streamlined processes of diagnosing a company well, of building a brand personality and brand positioning, going through all of these questionnaires, interviews, focus groups with with people, with their, with my clients, customers, to understand their personalities, to build these maps and build an evidence-based sort of branding process as a whole. And as I was doing this more and more companies were like, oh, this is amazing. Like, we've helped a very local, small company go into 25 countries, 500 locations. We've scaled a very small idea-based startup in the UK to become second largest in their industry vertical in 3 years. We've done this like over and over and over again, Series A and B companies coming to us, and then, we'd go through this branding process with them and completely transforming what was happening with them. And so seeing that feedback coming back and back to us, honestly, like, the pricing for that is relatively high because there's a lot of research, a lot of work involved. And so I went into thinking, I was always very closely connected to startups, the incubators, the accelerators. And so how do we do something like this that can support earlier stage startups? Because it's so difficult for a startup to understand what their brand positioning is going to be, or at least what their brand personality is going to be. Because brand positioning, that's going to evolve over time. If you're early stage, is really tough. But for that founder to be able to transmit that idea that they have, that exactly what I said at the beginning, like, it starts the story from the founder, to explore that is really tough, especially for people who are more technical, right? Yeah. And so what I did was basically I turned a lot of the workshops that we had streamlined from Skins. I turned some of those workshops, connected them to AI. Now with all these language models, it's so much easier. So all those workshops are just videos, kind of very similar to this one, asking, the founders the questions that we've built over time, through all of the support from psychologists and psychiatrists and all the other business aspects that we've involved in. And then all those answers go through LLM, so these large language models, to support them in building this brand story that they can utilize. And so instead of them hiring us as a whole company, I've sort of shrunk that down into a small sort of product that early stage startups can get. And so it's a process. It's very cool for me because, this would have been possible like 3 years ago, pre-ChatGPT, I guess. Absolutely not. But then all of a sudden, me seeing and getting all that feedback from customers saying this was amazing. And then when I sat to mentor startups, they were like, oh my God, I never thought of it this way. But then when it came to pricing, they were like, oops, I'm a startup, I can't do it. It sort of came as part of that, to turn it into a product. I'm kind of really, really happy about it. I'm going to have a workshop soon with SeedSpot, one of these accelerators in the US, in the upcoming weeks, to talk about it and to also support startups and their brand. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing more and more of that feedback. So yeah.
This is the product that you named BrandStarter, correct? Yeah. And I have used this before. I've tested it. I was one of the early testers, which I'm very happy about that. I was testing on an idea that I was working on. And I think it goes beyond branding. It's safe to say it also helps you to think about the processes in the company, to think about what are some of the most important features, what is your value proposition. So I think it's more of a strategic move for an entrepreneur to start thinking about this early on. And my question is, at what stage should an entrepreneur start thinking about generally branding and potentially using this sort of tool in identifying what is their value proposition, what is a strategy that they want to use for their later on marketing campaigns and whatnot? Is it early on when they're testing their MVP? Is it later when they have some traction and they already have identified some customers? At what stage should an aspiring or an early stage company think about it?
Let's say at the very stage when you start thinking about acquiring customers. So for some, because in some industries, let's say medtech, for example, it takes years, and they don't start selling until they're something like Series B, because there's so much research and regulation that goes into it that they're not going to need the brand until they're ready, 2-3 years into the product to start selling it. In some industries, you start selling before you have a product. And so I would say the moment that you start to think about customer acquisition is the moment when you need to have that story. And in order for you to have that story to share, you need to build it through some layer of brand, right? And so it could be, at the beginning, you may as well just sell the features while you're talking one-on-one. But the moment you're pushing ads out there, so again, talking about customer acquisition as opposed to just, testing your market, the moment you're going for customer acquisition, 100%. Like you need to talk the language that your user talks. And it's all about building that story for them to believe what you're actually putting out there. So it's you better do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's right at the point when you're starting acquiring customers. I would argue maybe it could be even before that. When you're thinking about your value proposition, you can start already doing those exercises. It doesn't have to come out as like a branding strategy, but maybe just to do some of the exercises, because those were very useful for me as I was defining and thinking this through my company from a different perspective. So yeah, I would argue that could be even earlier than that. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I would say it depends because, like, accelerators like 500 startups, for example,
mhm,
will request a company to already have some layer of brand before they even publish them, or like before for them to apply or something like that, right? Some of these
yeah,
accelerators will actually have those requirements before, like, if you just have an idea, you kind of need to have some sort of logo and some sort of quick
yeah,
description and know who your competition is. All that is part of your brand as well. And so all of that is also part of what's requested in the brand pack, not including the logo, brand
mhm,
starter. And so within that, like if you're looking to raise money as well, that's when you still need to think of some layer of branding so that you attract those investors. Or if you're trying to clarify the idea of what you're trying to do, you still kind of need to work through it. So yeah, 100%. But I'm also trying to be budget conscious, as most startups are. And
yeah.
so it's usually much easier to think of investing in branding when you know you're going to get some money back as you start acquiring customers. But otherwise, as early as possible is much better.
Yeah, I think as early as possible is definitely important, and it's important, very important, to be conscious of the finances for sure. I've done things quite differently at first. Like I've worked on a different idea a couple of years ago, and I've discussed this with you, and actually used your services to build out a branding strategy. Well, not necessarily a full on branding strategy, but more of a brand. And I realized that it was premature to spend money on actually building out a full blown brand with all of its elements and everything before I tested the product, before I went to the market. But I think something like a tool like a BrandStarter would be much better for someone who's starting out and needs a logo, needs something like I don't know, slogan and whatnot, and to have this as a package and to know that okay, I'm starting from this is and it's actually an exercise that you need to do versus like investing in a full branding and then understanding that this product is not going to work for you. So I've made that mistake before, and yeah, but vouching for the product, that's for sure. um, I want to switch gears a little bit and go back to the personal brand for entrepreneurs, and talk about something that I'm personally also struggling with, which is authenticity. Um, as someone who is not, I'm not an avid user of social media, but I'm trying to create presence both on LinkedIn and on Instagram and TikTok, which I'm really bad at right now. But I'm struggling with being authentic, professional, um, also vulnerable a little bit, because I want to show that I have weaknesses, and I want to show people my real self, not just like, oh, this is the best of me, and then you're not going to see what's worse. But as an entrepreneur, how can I strike this balance between professionalism, authenticity, and vulnerability, if I may say so?
So, I mean, I need to put a disclaimer out there. I'm still a graphic designer by profession. So, we do all the research, and there's other people in the team that will do the psychological research, and the psychologist within the team. So I'll take this. I'll tread lightly in this.
Mhm.
But I'd say, first and foremost, there's a book that came to mind once you mentioned TikTok and Instagram and all these media. There's a book from like the 50s. It's Marshall McLuhan. The medium is the message. It's a beautiful book. I get all my students to always read that. It's like a 5 minute read. It has more images than it has, actual text. But he makes a point for how the medium shapes what we perceive, what we receive as viewers, right?
Mhm.
So on TV, the TV will make you change the message itself because it's very different from a printed newsletter, right?
Right.
And so because of that, your tone of voice. And that's why we will struggle, for example, with TikTok, but maybe not so much with Instagram. And maybe that was because we started Instagram back when we were in high school and everybody was doing it. So we were the people to build what Instagram is, whereas TikTok is all these other generations, and we're struggling with this new format because the medium pushes what kind of message we can put out there. And so it really becomes uncomfortable. And so I think one of those first things is to really understand that the medium is the message to a certain degree. And because of that, maybe, and just maybe, it's worth sticking to the medium that's best for you. So this will in you being more yourself, right? First of all, let's create an environment that allows you to be more of yourself. And then once that starts working, then you can experiment with, one more thing. There's this super a very successful entrepreneur here in the region, and the guy said, I never go for two unknowns. For example, a new product in a new market. I only go for one. I either know the product really well and it has worked in my usual market and I go to a new market, or in my market, I try a new product. So in this case, I'd rather say either we go for understanding who we are within the media of our choice already. And then once we've done that, we can expand on the new media, but we already know who and what we like and what we want to show, or vice versa. We know the media, but then we're exploring ourselves. So that's one of those things. I'd say medium is the message is one of those things it's always in my mind. The second part, I think it has to do a lot with the story that you want to put out there. There's a lot of soul searching, of course. There's a lot of you understanding who you are. The second part is I wouldn't necessarily say that we need to put all of ourselves out there. I'd say every media, and I've also done a bit of research and a bit of work in 2017 around how our egos and ourselves are very different in each media. So on Facebook, I'm a very different person. On Instagram, I'm a different person. And there was then later all these memes about my picture on Tinder versus my picture on LinkedIn versus and so we are different people in different media by default. And so because of that, we don't necessarily have to show all of it. I think there needs to be nuance. There's quite a few cool exercises, especially around brand now that we're talking about it, where you can put your hero story and your antithesis and your kryptonite, so to speak, explore those for yourself so that you know what you're putting out there. But also there's one more thing that I really want to push out there, and this is something that I've enjoyed from a lot of people that I see online. They may show a lot of aspects of their personality, but there are some of them that just stick their guns to what they know best. So if it's just information and they're very serious, they just do that. They're not going to show a lot of emotion because that's who they are. And then all of a sudden that just seems better because it's what they are. It's like those videos. I view a lot of these videos on YouTube, let's say about philosophy, and it's just like somebody reading a text. I never see the face. There's these weird illustrations. But honestly, I get everything that they're saying because their ability to write for me to understand some complex philosophical topic is amazing. And because that's their strength, I don't need their emotions. They're amazing. It's just bringing that information to me. So I'd say, it's about finding what your strength is and not necessarily trying to show every aspect of yourself just because it's now become a trend to sort of show all of that. It's more about finding what is most comfortable to you and then amplifying on that. And there's a really cool graph on game design, by the way, which applies to, I think it's, the state of flow, how to read the state of flow. So if if your ability exceeds the difficulty, then you're going to be bored about it. If the difficulty exceeds your ability, then you're going to be anxious about it. And so if it's somewhere in between these two, you're on a state of flow. And so I wouldn't say that, just because I'm now kind of requested by the trends to also be vulnerable in front of the camera, and I really feel bad about that I should put myself through that sort of tough experience. Why should I? Maybe I'm a more personal sort of, private person. I don't like to show that. But the information that I have is important, I believe. And so I'll share the information that I believe is important. So I feel that's potentially a better way of being honest with oneself as well as with the audience, is to share what you believe has more value as opposed to trying to share all of yourself, because it's not necessarily a personal diary. It's more about let's see what I can help other people. And so that's where I stand on it, but that's more of a personal view than it is a sort of a general rule of thumb on how things work. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. No, I love it. I've particularly marked a couple of things that I want to delve deeper into. One is you mentioned the hero story. Can you give me a bit more details on what you mean when you say the hero story?
So look, we all see ourselves as somewhat moving through a hero journey for ourselves, right? Where I
Mm-hmm.
want to be in 10 years, in 15 years, if I have an image of that. And even if I don't, there's this whole aspect of the Ubermensch from Nietzsche's, right? My
Yeah.
ideal self. And so my ideal self will most probably be very different from your ideal self, right? But if I visualize and I write it and I act upon my ideal self's virtues, then chances that I'm going to be more honest with what I'm saying are much higher because I'm
Mm-hmm.
aspiring for it. I'm really trying for it, right? And then if I also have my antithesis story, like for example, I don't like to deal with, and I've been vocal about this in most cases, but like as an agency, we don't work with political parties. We don't work with religious organizations, right? It's where we draw the line. The reason why is because we know the effect that we've had on people for different companies. We've seen how we can really shift people's minds with like a simple sort of message that we put out there, and consciously so, knowing what the effects are going to be. And so as a result, I'm going to say this is where I draw my line, and so I don't want to deal with all of that, right? Or like
Mm-hmm.
I don't stand for this and this and this cause at all. I don't care that that's topical and it's all cool to talk about it. And so putting where you're sort of what you're clarifying, what your sort of enemies and kryptonite are, as well as what your Ubermensch is, I think allows you to much easily as a brand and as a company, and as an individual on social media, to navigate the waters of where you want to be or not. Otherwise, when it's ambiguous, you might find yourself saying something today and then something else tomorrow, and then those two contradict each other, and your audience is not really gonna want to be connected to you. So I feel
Yeah.
like it's relatively important that as you're going through this brand story, you clarify what that sort of that peak and that valley is for you, and what you
Mm-hmm.
want to be associated with and not. Clarify that, write that down, and then keep to it for as long as you believe those are relevant for you. So
Mm-hmm. Love it. It's super interesting. I also like the idea of you need to start with understanding yourself before you actually start crafting the brand itself, or your personal brand. And that's something that I've been struggling with myself as well. I've really invested a lot of time. Maybe 4 years ago, I had a complete meltdown. Like I had a little bit of mental health challenges. Well, things didn't work out the way that I wanted to, and it was super difficult for me at that time. So I did a lot of soul searching for about 2, 3 years in a row. I read as much as I could. I did meditation. I tried as all the type of tools possible, and some things worked, some things didn't. But the point being, connecting this back to the personal brand, is I still am am having a hard time finalizing who I am, because I believe that I'm such a person who evolves so fast and things change so fast for me. Maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's not, but how am I to portray myself through social media or to build a personal brand on something that is completely not stable and evolves all the time. So I've been having hard time thinking about personal branding and the strategy itself. So I've been searching for like things that would help me to do that. If you could help me think about this, like what is one exercise or one thing that I should start with as I'm crafting a personal brand for myself, or the story?
um, I'll think about that for a second then. So there's something that came to mind, which is it's very weird to say, and um,
It's okay. We
so I
like
don't
weird
have,
stuff.
yeah, look, in the sense that like I'm not prepared well enough to talk about it, so to say, because I haven't read enough about it. So I'm just gonna throw it out rather than, please don't take this, don't quote this. But so there's this whole aspect of the feminine and the masculine in the grand scheme of things,
Mhm.
in the sense of the universe as opposed to the human themselves. And then a friend of mine said, the masculine gives it direction, the feminine gives it depth. And
Mhm.
so in that sense, some of us are deeper and we don't necessarily see the direction. We don't necessarily have like this goal, but the depth at which we perform sort of makes us do anything very well. But not necessarily that we have this end goal, that we have this direction. It's more like the way that we do things is more in depth than it is about the vision. So when you think about the general idea of an entrepreneur, is the guy that has the vision, the person that has the vision, right? So the person, sort of that masculine aspect of just like having direction. But this is what we're used to talk about, and that doesn't mean that they also didn't have the aspect of diving deep into the work and knowing more about you and what you've done. I'd say the depth of your work might be the answer to the question, as opposed to the vision and the sort of the end goal. So we're all humans. We're all constantly evolving in our lives, and so it's not about who I am. It's more about who I want to become. Viktor Frankl has some amazing aspects on this. In sort of you don't treat the person for who they are today, but more so for who they can be, and that way they can reach that point. And so I think this is one of those ways to do this in your personal brand. You don't treat yourself necessarily who you are today. It's more like who you want to be, that Ubermensch that Nietzsche talks about. So maybe we look at that. An exercise that we always do in brand personality is we ask the person to think of their brand and their company as if it was a person. And so close your eyes, think of that as if it were a person, take 5 minutes by a timer. And so we count that. And that's part of the brand starter as well. Here's a counter, 5 minutes. Explain that person in adjectives only. Go, right? And then just drop in adjectives. And then you start to build this image, and that tells you what that look and feel feels right for you, right? And then do the same for tone of voice, just that. And so you don't necessarily need to have the topics, but by having the means, the method, and the way that you communicate, the personality of how you communicate, that may as well orient more or less the topics and the aspects that you want to put out there. So I'd say first, to answer that question, first, definitely to look and understand into a general idea of what the vision and purpose statement are for you. Second, clarify a bit of the personality that you want to put out there. And then third, look at the market around you, look at the competition and see where that fits. And so this builds your brand personality. Funny enough, that is literally sort of the structure that BrandStarter has if you actually go through it in more depth. So, vision gives it a bit of direction. Purpose gives it the depth. Look and feel, tone of voice, brand personality gives it the means, the method, the how you're going to do what you're doing. And then competition clarifies where that space, or where are you carving that space in the market. And so I think by going through this, these may as well be very, very helpful. Generally, the way that you sort of clarify your vision and your purpose, especially the way that we like to do it, is by looking at the past, not at the future. So it's a bit counterintuitive because, a purpose statement and a vision are generally something to look up to the future for. Yeah. We go by looking at the past. What has made you proud before? What has worked best for you? Because we generally understand ourselves by looking at ourselves from a distance, as opposed to just imagining new things, because then we have to live up to that expectation, and that's really hard and daunting. We want to build up new expectations when we're building the brand. The expectation is on the consumer, then on to build for us, but we already need to be delivering that. And so we look at what we already have, what we already are, and who we already are. So it's about looking back. It's about looking at facts over fiction. And so we build everything that we want to build on top of the facts that we've built over time. So I think that really helps. But then again, this is a process. It's not a single answer type of aspect. But say, the vision, purpose, and then brand personalities, look and feel, tone of voice, and then brand positioning, and all of these sort of build this overall idea of how to deal with this, I suppose.
That's super cool. So we're basically treating personal branding similarly to branding for a regular startup, for instance.
100%. Yes, because if we start at the beginning of this conversation, the founder's story is the one that sort of is amplified towards the company themselves, generally speaking. The difference is with the company is that we're talking about the product then, right? So it is the personality of the founder meshed with the features and the benefits of the product, right? So the
Mm-hmm.
personality generally comes from the founder, and then the features and the benefits come from the product. Whereas in personal brand is, your own personality as well as the values that you bring to the society as an individual. So it's the product changes, but the personality remains the same, so to speak.
Yeah, that's fascinating, I must say. I think you have really created, if you think about you and your expertise using a Venn diagram, you've really been able to find this sweet spot, which is between design, psychology, a lot of research that you've done in different areas, and a little bit of philosophy as well into that. And like, there's your sweet spot right in the middle of all of those different various expertise and knowledge that you bring to the table. And I think that's really fascinating. I love that about you. Every time we speak, I learn something new. So that's super, super cool. I have very few conversations where I can say that I learn a lot from a person just for 10 minutes, but you're just definitely one of those people that I've had honor talking to, who really brings a lot to the table, and not just your own personal expertise, but you're able to bring research and a lot of knowledge, which very well articulated really makes a difference.
Really appreciate that. That's a lot of really nice words at once I'm not used to. So thank you.
I doubt that. Well, how can newly minted entrepreneurs access BrandStarter? Because I think that it's such a valuable tool. It has been valuable for me. Is it open to public, or is it just you can use it through accelerators and incubators and whatnot?
It is open to public. In fact, we're looking to turning it into also a workshop format. So basically a group thing where we get a couple of startups at once to walk them through it. So
Mhm.
currently, you could just go to the website brandpack.us,
Mhm.
and there it is, just the usual type of product. Whereas for accelerators, we've put in as many accelerators as we've had the opportunity to. We've put it in the perks list so they can get it with a much lower price, just because we know that they're very early stage and they're still sort of doing that.
Yeah.
Any startup that needs support in that, or even if you can't afford it, because look, I come from a country where it was really hard to afford any of the software for a very long time, and I've gotten a lot of value out of people who've just supported me. So anyone can just reach out to me on LinkedIn, and then I'm happy to share at least some sort of discount code or something in return for a testimonial or some feedback or something, that we can at least get the product better together. And so we always love to do that. So 100% anyone can join us. Otherwise, brandpack.us,
Yeah.
it's the website, and
We
that's
will
that.
link it down in our comments and link all of your information as well, so that people can reach out to you. Um, Last question, and I know we're out of time, but do you think you have found your purpose, Leart?
Oh yes, 100%. So it's interesting because look, from a company perspective, it's very straightforward. I want to build conscious businesses. That's it. I
Yeah.
want any business that I work with to know exactly what they're doing with the people that they're working for or with, so to speak, right? For their customers. I don't want
Mhm.
products to work just because they're working for them. I want them to know the effect that they have on people. And this is what happens with every single client that we meet, that we do the research for. So if we're doing the research with their sort of with their customers, right away they will understand, oh wait, look at all of these effects that we've had in these people. And so I want people to really know what's going on, because once they do, then our the ethics and morals within ourselves as humans kicks in. And so that really starts to shift and change how businesses move and operate. So that's why that's definitely my purpose. I just want to work with entrepreneurs and support these entrepreneurs to build businesses that are conscious. So conscious first businesses. So for me as an individual, I've gone more through a path of sort of trying to build, so similarly become more conscious on everyday sort of on everyday actions, so to speak.
Mhm.
But within this, the purpose is to sort of start creating products that are more connected to a more sort of natural order of things, as opposed to just the commercial aspect of it. And so there's some really cool scientists I'm following. One of them is Neri Oxman. She's building some incredible stuff, like, she's trying to communicate with plants through perfumes and stuff like that. So she's trying to build buildings that are, more in the, build what rather than build, grow buildings, so that we sort of turn and communicate with nature a bit more. And I'm going more into that direction of whatever service and products we're building, to be more and more connected to the natural state of being, so to speak, understanding that's a packed word and easily sort of debatable, but within that idea, more or less.
And I know we're out of time, but just out of curiosity, during the day, do you feel when as you're working, let's say on things, and I know you meet a lot of clients, you do a lot of work, like you do podcasts as well. How often do you catch yourself thinking, okay, I am in a state of flow, or I am happy doing what I'm doing? Does it happen very often, or are there times when it's super challenging and you're just like, I'm giving up?
To be honest, entrepreneurship for me is very challenging. It's not one of those things that I'm very happy to do. I'm more of still like on mindset. I'm like a 3D designer and graphic designer, and I still like to like sit down and do stuff. That's where I'm when I'm in a state of flow. But I've put some goals and I've put some sort of challenges for myself as an individual. I've decided that I need to do, it's like when you're in elementary school and you really don't like biology, for example, because like it's one of those topics you can't get it through for some reason.
Mhm.
um Business in general is almost like that for me. I do enjoy it. I've learned to enjoy it a lot, but it is one of those challenges that I've decided to go with, and it's brought me the level of maturity in my life that I never anticipated I'd get anywhere. And so
Mhm.
the long-term sort of results have really shifted my mind around what even the state of flow for me as an individual means. I would have never done that in a million years if I continued to do just graphic design, right? I wouldn't be
Mhm.
the same person at all. It really challenged me in ways that I wouldn't have imagined, right? And so for that, I've decided to push through with this. I've put some goals, I've put some timelines. If I don't reach it by then, that's totally fine. Then I have the time to just like relax, so to speak, and then just do things that would be more so in a, if I may, constant state of flow. For now, there's quite a few things that do so, and I enjoy those thoroughly. But to be honest, I've put myself through a relatively difficult path, for me. So ultimately, in a grand scheme of things, it's nothing, great, so to speak, like nothing crazy. I'm not building Facebook, but the idea
We never
that
know, maybe in the next few
well,
years.
fair enough.
Yeah.
But it's been extremely rewarding in the long run. And
Mm.
constantly when I look back, so it's very hard on day to day, but anytime I just stop, breathe, and then look back, I'm like, I would have never changed this for a million years. So sort of it has really changed for me as to where I see the reward to what I'm doing. And so 100%, not so much in a state of flow, but I think in a very big and almost constant state of gratitude, which is a very different place to be, I think.
Yeah, amazing. I love that. With that, thank you so much, Lert. It was an amazing conversation. I wish we had more time to get into your soul a bit more, but I think we have enough information that we can share with the aspiring entrepreneurs and help them build their personal brand and start the entrepreneurial journey and understand their purpose. Also, like think about this exercise of building a personal brand, not just for the sake of building a brand for social media, but for themselves, understanding who they are. And actually, when they work on something, on a startup or an organization, a business, whatnot, it comes from a place of purpose and comes from a place of conscious decision that you're doing something, and it comes from knowing yourself, not for the sake of putting it out there on social media. Thank you for that.
Oh yeah, I mean, look, any business will test your limits like crazy. So, once you're
Yeah.
out there in the pitches, you'll realize very quickly where your limits are and more or less who you are sort of in tough situations. That kind of
Yeah.
tends to open up some aspects. So 100%. But otherwise, thank you so much for the time. It's really been great talking to you as always. But this time more so, I think we had the chance to talk more about, other stuff than just, work and let's do this type of project. So I really
Yeah.
appreciate that at the time. So thank you.
Same here. And shout out to Liridona who actually connected us.
100%. Yeah, I'll be pinging her soon.
Amazing. Thank you.